we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Benjamin Newton. I'm the Environmental Sustainability Director at Central Community College. Welcome everyone to our final Sustainability Leadership Presentation Series of the 2019-2020 academic year. We are glad you have joined us today, and we are also very fortunate to have such a great group of SLPS partners. I want to remind all attendees that you are in listen-only mode and to prevent your background noises, but you're also invited to ask questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and then I'll ask the questions at the end. You can put your questions directly into that WebEx chat box. And then I wanted to remind everyone that today's presentation is also being recorded. So if you want to view the presentation in the future, it will be available at cccneb.edu/SLPS, probably in about a week. So today's SLPS host is Sarah Gewurz, the Assistant Professor of Digital Art, and is also the advisor for the Student Environmental Action Coalition at Hastings College. So welcome, Sarah.
Hello, all. Thanks, Ben. I'm going to introduce our speaker today, who's Jason Carbaugh, who's a faculty at Hastings College. He just joined us as a visiting assistant professor. He completed his BS in biology at Purdue University-Fort Wayne, a M.N.S. in biology at Southeast Missouri State University, and a Ph.D. in entomology at Texas A&M University. He's also taught at several higher education institutions before joining us at Hastings College. His interests include behavior and ecology of insects, especially ants, which is what he's going to be talking to you about. Other interests include the impacts of invasive species on ecosystems, along with macroinvertebrates as bioindicators to determine the health of aquatic and terrestrial habitats. He enjoys educating others about the diversity of animals and environmental issues. And so I'm going to hand it off to our speaker, Jason.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending my talk about the impacts of invasive species on ecosystems with a focus on ants. So I'll start off with a slide here showing a neat scenery of I'll say woods with a stream flowing, and this ecosystem here looks fairly healthy, at least from this picture aspect. But imagine if a new species was randomly introduced into this ecosystem, whether on land or in the water, and then it could potentially cause problems. So overall, what is an invasive species? This involves a non-native species that's introduced to a new area, either purposely or accidentally, and it can potentially cause disruption to ecosystems. And so with the disruption, this can involve from changing, I'll say, the nutrient levels in the ecosystem, or having an effect on native species. And overall, invasive species are one of the biggest threats to biodiversity in natural environments. And some issues I got listed here, I've talked about environmental concerns, but they can also have economic concerns and also human health concerns. And invasive species has been increasing more and more, especially with global trading happening across the world, introducing both new plant and animal species in different parts of the world. My first knowledge about invasive species was zebra mussels. I actually learned this during the, I'll say, the 1990s. The zebra mussels are originally from the Caspian and Black Sea, and they were introduced into the Great Lakes. in the late 1980s, and then from there they've been spreading in different areas, including here in Nebraska. With these zebra mussels, they can cause damage to water treatment and power plants, especially like clogging pipes, because you can get so many of them in one area, and they compete for food and substrate surfaces with native species. Another example of an invasive species here in the US is the Asian jumping worm. And this has just recently arrived actually here in the US, believed to be around 2008. And these jumping worms, they appear to be like earthworms, which is shown as a smaller version here, while the Asian jumping worm is this longer version here. It's noted that they even move like a snake, and that they actually don't burrow into the soil. They stay on top of the soil surface. And one of the things that they do is they consume large amounts of leaf litter in the forest. And that can have an effect because overall they're taking the nutrients out of the soil, which then can have an effect on the plants living in the forest. And like I said, they've been recently introduced into the US, and they are spreading, looking at the map here. And this map does not include Nebraska as having them, but with updated information, they are found in a few counties now that officials in the state have asked for ones to report this if you do see this in the state, this jumping worm. So that's another example of invasive species there. Now, I've been talking about animals being invasive, but plants also can be invasive, such as the garlic mustard here. The garlic mustard is actually originally from Europe, Asia, Northern Africa, but has found its way to North America, seen the shaded area in the map here where it's present at. And it can become a really dominant plant in an ecosystem, and therefore can reduce the biodiversity in an area. And the thing is with these garlic mustard plants is herbivores usually do not want to consume these plants because they don't taste well, or they're even toxic to the herbivore. So the plants are just left alone and can continue growing without having anybody consuming them. And for my last general invasive species I'll introduce here, islands can really be affected by invasive species. One of the great examples here is the brown tree snake here in Guam. Guam located in the area of Southeast Asia here. And this snake was believed to be introduced after World War II due to the movement of military equipment on the different islands. And in Guam, it has caused the loss of bird species, rodents, and it is even affecting the dispersal of seeds by plants. And then even on top of that, even causes power outages on the island. So that's been a problem, having a brown tree snake there in Guam. Some general characteristics of invasive species shown here. These are just general ideas. It might not cover all invasive species, but some of the big points here is they have few, if any, natural predators, competitors, parasites, or diseases in their introduced area. They also may have a high reproductive rate, making a lot of offspring. They can live long lives, potentially long lives. They can be generalists, and think of this in like a diet form in which they can feed on different things instead of being a specialist, feeding on just certain things. They can have their diet is a variety of different things. And they're also classified as pioneer species. Pioneer species are species that tend to find like new areas in which there's not many other organisms, and those areas can tend to be unpredictable, the situation that's present there. So overall, these are just some general characteristics of invasive species. Now, for me, I am an entomologist, but more specifically, I'm a myrmecologist, meaning that I study ants. And that's where I'm going to be heading next here about invasive ant species. And shown here is a type of a rover ant that has actually been introduced into the southern part of the US that's originally from South America, and it's being a pest in people's homes. So invasive ant species is a global problem. They cause serious impacts both ecologically and economically. The biggest impact, as with any invasive species, is they decrease the biodiversity. The characteristics, and these are just general characteristics of invasive ant species. They can have multiple queens within a colony. Now, many ant species tend to only have one queen, but there's invasive ant species that tend to have multiple queens in them. And then the second characteristic I have there is they have interconnected nests or colonies in which you can have different colonies working together instead of being territorial. You got all these workers working together. You also have a high rate of foraging going on, looking for food. And then the last characteristic, which is the most important of all, is the colony size is a lot larger than the native ant species. Go through some examples of few examples of invasive ant species. Famous one here is the Argentine ant, which is an aggressive ant that is originally from the southern part of South America, and the native range that's shown here, but has been introduced in different parts of the world, including Australia, southern tip of Africa, parts of Europe, and including here in North America. Biggest thing with the Argentine ant is that they can displace the native ants, and their colonies can become really massive in size. That it's actually believed that the whole state of California is this one big super colony, where I'll say that the workers pretty much all get along together and they're not being territorial towards each other. Another example of an invasive ant species is the European fire ant, or also known as a ruby ant. This ant is originally from Europe, but has been slowly being introduced to Asia and to parts of North America, especially in the northern part here, northeast part of the US and around British Columbia. And with these ones, these are also aggressive, like the Argentine ants, and they can also displace native ants, but there is also a human health concern too when humans get stung by these ants. And then, of course, the main bulk of my talk here is about the red imported fire ant, the Solenopsis invicta. And this is a popular ant that is studied here in the US and in different parts of the world, and how much damage it has caused being introduced into different areas. And I've done some research that I will be discussing a little bit later with them, and can be tied to reducing, potentially reducing their populations. So here's a map of the distribution of the red imported fire ant. Their native range is also in South America, like the Argentine ants, but they have been introduced into other parts of the world, especially, yes, the southern part of the US here, Caribbean islands, and then a few other parts, including in Southeast Asia here. I will say that in the past, Australia and New Zealand's been trying to control the populations in their part. And then some of these marks here, especially here in India and the Philippines, could be misidentifications. I have talked to a few ant researchers in the Philippines, and they said they have not found any colonies of the red imported fire ant. So these could be just mislabeled. And that's also true in parts of the North America here. There's some that are fairly high up in the northern part that could be mislabeled. This point right here, I believe this is supposed to be labeling Omaha. So here in Nebraska, in the past, there has been colonies of the red imported fire ant found in Omaha, more specifically in the zoo there, in which the colonies were immediately destroyed. What happened was they were bringing plants in from the southern part of the U.S., and they weren't being fully inspected before they introduced them into the zoo. So they're probably more careful now in how they inspect plants in that sense. Another thing to think about too with these distribution is that the red imported fire ant is limited by arid conditions and cold temperatures. So they're not going to be able to be everywhere in the world due to these conditions, these specific conditions that they need. I'll go through some of the biology here about the red imported fire ant. Their mounds that they make can be fairly large, as you see in this picture here. You can see these mounds far away in the distance. And they like to make their colonies in open, disturbed areas, which are generally caused by humans being, disturbed areas. So what I'm saying is you're not going to find these in like a forest. You'll find these more in like a field or in urban environments. And another thing about them is they can consume different things. Their diet is varied in different things. They can feed on arthropods. They can obtain honeydew from aphids and scales. Aphids and scales are other insects. And they will also feed on small vertebrates that have recently died or are very young. Their diets can vary. The colonies, many of the colonies of the red imported fire ant have workers that are classified as polymorphic workers, meaning that the workers vary in body sizes, as shown here in the picture. And the workers are actually divided up into 3 general categories based on their sizes, in which we got minors, medium, and majors. The minors tend to be the smaller workers. The media are going to be the mid-sized workers, and then the majors are going to be the largest workers, shown here. And then off to the side is shown the queen here. There's 2 different social forms that exist with the red imported fire ant. And these social forms are based on the number of queens that are present in the colony. We can have monogyne colonies or polygyne colonies. Monogyne has 1 queen. Polygyne will have more than 1 queen. And in monogyne colonies, with the 1 queen, the queens overall are generally large, with large workers. The workers are aggressive towards other colonies. They are less destructive, and they do have a smaller population and density compared to polygyne colonies, in which with polygyne colonies we have, multiple queens, but those queens are smaller in size, along with the workers. The workers are less aggressive, in which they're not as territorial. And with all that, they can be more destructive and have that large population density. That's the 2 social forms for the red imported fire ant. And of course, there's the health concerns. The fire ants, the red imported fire ants will, for defense purposes, will sting other organisms. And this is one that's being shown stinging a human here. First thing they do is they take their mandibles, these jaw-like appendages, and they'll pinch the skin, get a hold, a grasp to the skin, and will take their abdomen with a stinger at the end and start stinging the individual. As they sting, they inject venom into the organism. And some people have an allergic reaction to that venom that can even potentially cause death to them. It's important in terms of health concerns with these red imported fire ants. And here's this, some of the effects that can happen when with multiple, being multiply stung by the workers here. These are little postulates that are forming here. And this person's arm's been stung multiple times. Definitely have serious impacts here in the U.S. here, especially in the agricultural aspect. They do affect our crops. They even affect our livestock. They affect fruit orchards, especially the citrus trees in Florida. And they also affect the invertebrates, including lizards and birds. With birds, they'll get into the nest of birds and consume the eggs. Now, there's been different approaches in attempting to reduce their populations in introduced areas where they've been introduced at. A common one is the use of baits. Baits are very effective in controlling populations over large areas with minimal effects on the environment. Baits are generally made out of corn grit particles, as shown in this photo here, and those corn grit particles are covered with soybean oil along with a toxin that can hopefully destroy the colony as the workers are consuming the corn grits for food source. There's been other methods in reducing their populations, including biological control agents. One of them is being shown here, a pord fly. Pord flies are actually native to South America, but they have been recently introduced in the southern part of the U.S. after a lot of research to make sure that they are safe to introduce to reduce the populations of red imported fire ants. And what they do is they'll sting the red imported fire ant and inject an egg inside their body. That egg will start developing inside the body, and eventually it'll reach up into the head region and consume the, I'll say, the brains and the muscles in the head. And then, as you can see here in the photo, the head will come off then, and then the pord fly, the larval form, will finish developing inside the head, and then it'll emerge as an adult and then repeat the cycle. And there's been pathogens introduced to them, such as Thalidomida, shown here. Thalidomida has been known to reduce the weight of the queens, that their weight is reduced so much, then they'll stop producing eggs. So some of the research I've done in the past has involved looking at how do the red imported fire ants perceive objects? And the results of my research can actually be potentially used to reduce their populations in non-native areas, including like here in the US. And this is showing a worker here that's in a defense position with its stinger out ready to go. And it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a droplet of venom that has been released at the very end there. So before I fully talk about my research, I want to talk more about the general biology of the red imported fire ants, or even in generalness of ants. So you'll have a better understanding about my research once I go in detail more about it. Ants in general rely heavily on chemicals for communication purposes. This is how they work together. This is how they know to perform certain tasks and to recognize each other is all by chemicals. Some example chemicals here, also known as pheromones, can be alarm pheromones, especially if they come across an ant from a different species or from a different colony. And this can send in like recruitment for help and fighting against this intruder. Chemicals are also used for foraging or looking for food by making trails with the chemical so you can recruit others to the food source. There's multiple glands found inside ants that produce chemicals for this communication purpose. Some of the glands I'll point out here, one is the mandibular gland, that's here in the head region. This one is one that produces and releases the alarm pheromones. Another gland here showing the Dofor's gland in the abdomen area. This one releases the trail pheromone used for foraging purposes. So there's different types of glands for communication purposes. For my research, I studied pheromones or chemicals related to recognition, the recognition purposes in ants. Pretty much, I'm talking about chemicals that they use to recognize nestmates within the same colony versus non-nestmates that be found in a different colony. But recognition chemicals can also indicate the status of the individual, whether they're a worker or a queen, or if it's just looking at workers, whether they're nurses tending to the young, or if they're foragers out looking for food. The recognition chemicals can indicate all that. And the main focus with my research was looking at how they recognize nestmates, which is important, especially if you want to keep resources for your colony, not be sharing it with other colonies. Now, it's believed that there's strong evidence that hydrocarbons is useful for recognition purposes, a type of chemical. And it's also wondered if lipids could be useful for recognition purposes also. So I actually looked at those for research purposes, both of those. Now, I'll talk a little bit about hydrocarbons here, since there's more evidence about them being used for recognition purposes. Hydrocarbons are produced inside the ants, and then will be secreted to the exoskeleton, to the outer part. Or it can be stored inside the postpharyngeal gland that's located in the head region, that's shown here in this figure. And then from there, the hydrocarbons are transferred to others in the colony. So then everybody will have the same, I'll say, chemical profile or template in terms of hydrocarbons. The way it can be transferred is such as grooming, physical contact with each other, or by the process of trophallaxis. Trophallaxis is the sharing of liquid food. So any stored hydrocarbons in the postpharyngeal gland will be potentially released during that process. And then the idea is then, how do you test to see like what's the chemical profile of another individual? That involves attendal touching, pretty much using the antennae as sensory to figure out the chemical profile of the other individual, involving a tactile communication in which they'll receive information to detect if there's any differences in the hydrocarbons, such as if there's like no difference or a very small difference in the hydrocarbons, then there's a good chance that it's a nestmate. The other individual's a nestmate, so then there's no problem. However, if there's a large difference in the hydrocarbons in the chemical profile, then there's a good chance that a fight can break out, because there'll be like two different individuals, possibly from two different colonies, if they're the same species, or they can be two different species. And the figure that's actually shown there is a unique type of ant, especially with their long mandibles shown there. But those are Indian jumping ants that are shown there. So for me to study the recognition chemicals, I look at monogyne and polygyne colonies, and more specifically on the chemicals, I look at cuticular hydrocarbons and polar cuticular lipids. And I place these chemicals on inanimate objects, actually glass beads. And this is so it can focus only on chemical cues and nothing else in that sense, especially like sounds or visual cues, just focusing on chemical cues. So overall, I was testing the idea, how do workers of both monogyne and polygyne colonies respond to those recognition chemicals? So I had 10 colonies, 5 of each, 5 monogyne, 5 polygyne. Look at the recognition chemicals I've already stated, and I placed them on colored glass beads that measured 2 millimeters in diameter. And I did this all in the lab setting. I actually did this in Texas when I was studying the red imported fire ants. And so inside the lab, I set up like a spatial environment for them, kind of like a home for them. Had a nice container, had sand filled on the bottom of the container. I gave them a nest area that was made of multiple petri dishes that actually involved multiple chambers, as shown here in this blown up version, in which generally the queen and her brood were located in the inner chamber. Also provided a water tube for them, and then on the opposite side provided some food for them, some crickets and honey water. And I started placing the beads with chemicals in various locations within their environment, such as near the food source, near the entrance of their nest, and also directly inside their nest, more specifically, right in that inner chamber area where the queen and brood were generally located. At each location, I had an experimental glass bead that involved the actual chemical that was being tested, and then a control bead that did not have the chemical applied to it. And I video recorded each location for about 15 minutes to watch the time that they interacted with the beads, along with their behavior response to the beads. I actually used a 4-point behavioral scale shown here. I had 1 listed as they ignored the glass bead, 2, they attenuated the glass bead, 3, they opened their mandibles towards the glass bead, and then 4, they bite the glass bead. For behavioral responses, I recorded the highest behavioral response that I've seen by that individual. So at first, what I'm saying is they could have like attenuated the bead, but if they eventually were biting the bead, then I stated that as a 4. 1 and 2 were actually classified as negative responses, while 3 and 4 were positive responses. And I recorded behavioral responses of the first 25 workers. And I wanted to show you some observations here of what I was looking at in the glass beads that were being used here. With this 1 glass bead here, you can see that this one's interested in it, in which they do have their mandibles opened up towards it. So that would have been listed as a 3 there. This individual here is actually biting the bead with its mandibles, so that would have been listed as a 4. Go through some of the results here. The colors of my bar graph are a little bit different here on the screen than my actual slide. They're actually a solid color on the slide, but this is showing time that they spent with the bead. So average time in seconds and colony type and recognition chemical. And one thing that really popped out was that the monogyne workers preferred the cuticular hydrocarbons, while the polygyne, they had no preference between the lipids or the hydrocarbons. And just going to focus now showing the results of the Monogyne colonies. I'll just show you different graphs. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with the graphs, but I'll just highlight a few areas here. So this is Monogyne shown near the food source. Side axis showing the percentage of workers, the behavioral responses on the bottom. Light colored bars are showing the hydrocarbons, and darker colored bars, the blue ones, are showing lipids here. One thing I want to point out is the workers attacked the cuticular hydrocarbons, shown this last part here with the biting. One thing I will point out though is that there was more of opening of their mandibles towards the lipids compared to the hydrocarbons. Then near the entrance, workers also attacked the cuticular hydrocarbons, and then again there was more of the opening of the mandibles towards the lipids here. And then inside the nest, there was no difference in behavioral responses. Pretty much there was a foreign object in there, and they just didn't want, they either didn't want to deal with it too much, or they wanted to try to get rid of it. So that's Monogyne. For Polygyne colonies, the picture's not as clear with the results there. Near the food source, the workers ignored the hydrocarbons, shown here. But I will say then again, as we've seen in Monogyne, that they open their mandibles up more to the lipids compared to the hydrocarbons. Near the entrance, the workers attack the cuticular hydrocarbons, shown here, while again we see this open mandibles towards the lipids. And then inside the nest, the workers attack the hydrocarbons, the beads with the hydrocarbons, while again then we see this more of the open of the mandibles with the lipids. So in conclusion, with their time, Monogyne workers spent more time with the cuticular hydrocarbons, while Polygyne workers, it just didn't matter between the lipids or the hydrocarbons. For the hydrocarbons, it seems like the workers attacked the beads with the hydrocarbons near the food and entrance, while the workers of the Polygyne attacked near the entrance and inside of the nest. And then as I kept stressing with the lipids, it seemed like the workers were displaying open mandibles more to them, the beads with the lipids, than the cuticular hydrocarbons. So with that, hydrocarbons are potentially useful in Monogyne colonies, but lipids, not sure. I mean, is it actually used for a recognition purpose, or is it possibly just a food source? And that's maybe why they just were just opening their mandibles to it, but maybe, that was it. I mean, more research needs to be done in that aspect. Now, I will say, while I was doing this study, I came across something interesting with these different colored beads that I was using to tell between like the experimental and the control. I noticed that it seemed like the workers were being attracted towards certain colors. Even though if the color that they were attracted to was a control bead, they pretty much then just attenuated the bead and then didn't want anything more to do with it. But I noticed beforehand that they were being attracted towards certain colors. So I wanted to do some research in this area, even though a few people have told me at that time, they were like, well, you're going to be wasting your time because ants are going to be relying a lot on colors. They're going to rely more on chemicals. And, I'm like, well, I think I know what I saw. I'm going to continue with my thoughts, my ideas. So perception in ants here. They do have receptors to detect sounds, magnetic fields, and vibrations. Some ant species do. But do ants have receptors to detect colors? Now, I say here that bees can perceive colors, and bees are actually closely related to ants. And that there has been studies showing that there have been a few ant species that can perceive colors by introducing different wavelengths of light to them and looking either at their behavioral response to the different colors of light or looking at the electrical activity in their eyes. And that was seen with the 3 species that I have listed here in the table, and they actually had preference towards certain colors, such as red light, and blue, green, and orange light, and green light. And within the same genus of the red imported fire ants with Solenopsis savissima, there was research done that they have a preference for green and near red wavelengths. But it's unknown in Solenopsis invicta, the red imported fire ant. So I was like, do they have the ability to discriminate colors? And if so, do they have a preference? And what I did is I worked with colored glass beads and using their instinct to dig into those colored glass beads. So I also did this in the laboratory, in which I used a petri dish, and this is showing the side view of a petri dish here. I had a petri dish. Underneath of it, I glued a plastic cylinder container to it, and I had a hole going into that container on the one side. And to balance it out, I had a rubber stopper then placed on the other side to balance out the entire petri dish. And I worked with 5 different colors that are shown there, and the bead size were approximately 0.9 millimeters in diameter, fairly small in size there. And I worked with 2 colors at a time by filling up 2 colored glass beads into the plastic cylinder container at a 50-50 ratio, in which the workers would be digging into the glass beads in that container. For this, I took workers from 4 Monogyne colonies and 6 Polygyne colonies, approximately 50 workers, and had them, like I said, digging into the plastic cylinder container. I had 2 different groups going on. One group I had digging in dark conditions, in which the workers dug for 1 hour, and I counted any glass beads that they took out of that plastic cylinder container and brought up to the surface of the petri dish. I also had another group digging in the light conditions for 1 hour and counted any glass beads that arrived to the surface of the petri dish also for them. This is what it was looking like while I was performing this study here, showing the workers digging into the container there and bringing up different colors of beads, in which I would count and see how many of each color there was removed from the container. Here's beginning the results here. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with these. I'll make a conclusion at the end after showing these graphs, but I got color pairs at the bottom axis and total number of glass beads brought up to the surface. And this is showing the control group here, the ones digging in the dark. And for most, the workers cannot discriminate the colors except yellow and orange, in which they have more of a preference for orange. For digging in light conditions, it was seen that workers can discriminate colors, and that's indicated by the asterisk, indicating that there is a difference between these colored pairs shown there. I'll continue on to the next slide to talk about what I've seen here. So looking at the color spectrum here, I got marked at 590 nanometers here. I noticed that the workers generally preferred colors above 590 nanometers, such as they had preference for orange and red. Now, there is an exception, though. They did have a preference also for green, but there was no difference between green and yellow. And then I will say that the least preferred color was blue. The least preferred color was blue in that with those research study. So with all that, I want to just bring up the idea that with the red imported fire ant can cause serious impacts both ecologically and economically, and there needs to be a way to reduce their populations, in which the results of my studies can actually potentially do that. Let's look back at baits. So as I mentioned, baits generally consist of horn grit particles, which have a general, I'll say, yellowish color to them. Well, it seems like yellow is not a preferred color by the red imported fire ants. That it might be better to introduce them baits of other colors to attract them better to the baits, especially colors of like orange and red, and possibly green. Another thing to take into consideration with baits is one bad thing about baits is when you introduce a bait to get rid of, I'll say, an invasive species like red imported fire ant shown here, it can also attract the native species that I have shown here off this side here, 3 different species of natives. It can also, the baits can also attract them, in which all their colonies would be gone then. So with the recognition chemical study that I performed, it looks like hydrocarbons would be useful in possibly attracting certain ants. More specifically, like the red imported fire ant, using specific hydrocarbons that will attract them. And what I'm saying is putting the hydrocarbons, applying it to the baits. And so there will be a better attraction between that bait and the red imported fire ants, in which the red imported fire ants will be removed, but the native species will not want anything to deal with that bait because they'll want to stay away from that specific chemical, that specific hydrocarbon. And there's actually been studies already done with this, that recognition chemicals are potentially becoming useful to apply to baits so that we're not having a large effect on the native ant species. So bringing back to, I was in the southern part of the U.S. studying the red imported fire ant, but coming back here to Nebraska. Now, from what I've seen so far, there are not any invasive ant species here in Nebraska, but that can always change. That can definitely always change. And there has been cases in the past, as I mentioned, at the zoo in Omaha, but those colonies were quickly destroyed, which is the best approach. If you find a colony, destroy the colony or introduce a toxic bait to the colony. However, if there is an established population, then more research should be done about that specific invasive ant species to figure out more about their biology, which then that kind of research or results from that research can be used to potentially reduce their population, such as even looking at recognition chemicals and color perception. So with that all said, I want to bring it back to the bigger picture. So I'm going away from the invasive ant species. Now I'm just talking about invasive species overall. And what can you do to prevent and introduce species from establishing a population? These are just some general rules to take into consideration. This includes cleaning any footwear or bags after hiking, especially to prevent carrying seeds of invasive plants. If you have a boat and if you use that boat in different bodies of water, it'd be a good idea to clean that boat between transporting it. So you're not carrying possibly an invasive species between different bodies of water. Do not buy invasive plants for your yard. And do not move firewood. And got an image here saying that hitchhiking insects like the emerald ash borer can kill forest because the emerald ash borer can actually be inside the firewood. If you're moving it, you can introduce the emerald ash borer into a new area. Also, do not release exotic animals in the wild, and volunteer to help remove invasive species from areas where they've established a population. So overall, I hope you learned more about the impacts of invasive species, and if enough research is conducted about the biology of the invasive species, then we can potentially use that information to reduce their populations in non-native areas. Are there questions?
All right, thank you, Jason. Very informative visual presentation on invasive species, in particular your research on the red imported fire ant is very interesting. We do have about 10 minutes here for questions, so I'll get started. The first question we have, and feel free to enter any questions you have in the chat box, and I'll ask those questions. But we do have a few questions so far that have come in. What is the most destructive invasive animal or plant in Nebraska, and why?
Oh, that's a good question, especially if you remember the introduction about me by Sarah. I'm just recently uh, newly hired here, and I actually first came to Nebraska here in past August. That I actually don't have enough information to even answer that question. What would be the most destructive invasive species? In that sense, there are several. There are several invasive species. I think I've seen an estimate of at least 20 or 30 have been listed. I don't know at this time which one's the most destructive. So I apologize for not being able to answer that question.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for that, and being newly. So you said you moved here how long ago?
Just in August.
Oh, in August. Okay.
Yeah. First time that even set foot in the state.
Okay. Um, all right. Well, we do have some more questions that are coming in. How did they destroy the ants at the Omaha Zoo, and is there evidence that they moved off-site from the zoo?
So from what I've seen, they did not indicate how they destroyed that site or how they destroyed the colonies, and in which they did, I think, have a few occurrences actually over a certain time period. But each time they said they destroyed the colony, like I said, they didn't describe the method, but it seems like they did make sure that they did not spread beyond that. One thing I do want to say though, if they did spread, there's a good chance that they would not have survived the winters here because they cannot handle cold conditions. They would love the summertime and they love the moisture that's here, but they wouldn't be able to handle the very cold temperatures.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Jason. Next question we have is on there's a fly that acts as a biological control agent for the fire ant. Has it been, this is a two-part question, has it been introduced in the United States?
So it has been, and it actually, there's been several species of that forward fly introduced into the U.S., mainly the southern part. I'll probably see what the second question is then.
All right, yeah, the follow-up to that one is, so if so, which you said that it was introduced, do we know how that fly acts only on the fire ant and not on other insects or species?
So as we indicated, plenty of research was done before introducing that fly to make sure the researchers didn't want to make sure that they would not have an effect on the native ant species in the southern part of the U.S., in which they do not. The board flies are very specific, looking for the red imported fire ants. And I will say, if you remember me talking about the workers being polymorphic, certain species of the board flies will actually look for certain body sizes of workers to lay their eggs in, to inject their eggs into the body of that worker. So they can be very specific in that sense, both on species level and body size.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Next question we have here in the chat box. is have you considered fungi as a possible remedy for fire ants? Because there is research supporting um, a particular type of fungi for carpenter ants.
I've seen I've seen a little bit of that research with a yeah with fungus, but I haven't looked in depth on it with the red imported fire ants. I'm probably other research has been done that I can't think of at this time.
Okay, yeah, they did mention Paul Stamets had done some research on the carpenter ant
Yeah.
and fungi for control of that species. Um, so uh, another question. All right. Another question that we have is, what are the positive attributes of particular native ants to the ecosystem?
Uh, so yeah, usually when we think of ants, we just see them as pests getting into our homes, into our food, that kind of stuff. But no, they can be helpful in the ecosystem. They can help move nutrients around um, in the soil, which then as they're moving nutrients around, that can help out with plants. And also, some ant species are known to disperse seeds of plants, which then will help with the population of plants. So that's just a few examples of what ants can do that are beneficial to the ecosystems in general.
Okay, thank you. We do have time for a couple more questions. So what are some of the invasive plants in zoos or arboretums that maybe you should watch out for if you want to plant them at your home or residence?
Uh, how much I could fully answer that question, come up with like a list of plants, because as I said, make sure you don't be planting invasive plants in your property or in your yard. But I don't have a list of plants that are invasive at this time for, especially for this specific area, especially with most of my focus on animals in that sense. So it's unfortunate that I couldn't come up with, a list of anything, but that can be found, I'm sure, online of list of invasive plants to not be buying or to be moving across, especially like state lines and stuff, or moving from different regions of the U.S.
Okay, and we have time for one last question here. And I do want to remind everybody that the presentation was recorded, and I'll put the link as soon as I ask this question here, but I'll put the link for our SLPS recordings that we've had since 2014 in the chat box. And then we'll have the YouTube video posted in about a week for you to view. But the last question we have here, if from your research, you mentioned that ants are attracted to certain colors, are they also attracted to certain plants because of their color, or do those plants also emit a specific pheromone that attracts them to those certain plants?
So with that, I don't know the full research and if they're being somewhat attracted to the color of the plants, especially that green thing and the green aspect. More research needs to be done about with that, because keep in mind there's not a lot of research done about color perception in ants, because as I mentioned, some people have even gone against me, like, well, no, ants aren't going to be seeing colors, which I, proved that wrong in that sense. But I will say that Ants can be attracted to some plants based on possibly chemicals, but they can also not be attracted to some plants based on the chemicals. Some plants release chemicals that ants will stay away from.
Okay, thank you. So that looks like I got to all the questions, and I want to thank Jason for his very informative research and presentation, and Sarah for being the host from Hastings College. So this concludes our Sustainability Leadership Presentation Series of the Spring 2020 semester. This, as I mentioned, the presentation was recorded and it will be available next week. I posted the link in the chat box. It'll be a YouTube video. We have, presentations going back as far as 2014 from all of our SLPS partners. So I want to thank all of those SLPS host partners, Metro Community College, Joslin Institute, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the Nebraska Recycling Council, Hastings College, Creighton University, and the University of Nebraska-Omaha. So this concludes our series for this year. I want to make sure everybody stays safe and healthy. And our next presentation will be in the fall, in September. So I hope you'll join us again in the fall.